Bring in Antoine Marie, a researcher in political psychology at the Centre of Political Research at Sciences Po in Paris, a major French research institute. He's been analysing the case in Lyon and looking at the broader patterns of political polarisation and its links to escalation of political violence. Antoine is here with me in the studio. Antoine, welcome to France 24.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Let's begin what we've just seen. The protests look calm at the moment. There is a significant police presence. The extent to which you think this is now becoming the defining issue, perhaps, if that's the right word, ahead of the French local elections coming up?
Yeah, that's quite possible. I think it's a little bit regrettable if that's the case, because according to the empirical data that we have, historical time series about political violence in France, produced by Isabelle Sommier and their colleagues, political violence is comparatively relatively low compared to the middle of the 20th century in France. There's been a little bit of an uptick since 2022 with the campaign of Éric Zemmour, and there's a sense that far-right activists are feeling emboldened by the prospect of a potential victory. But in terms of historical trends, the situation is not that bad, so I worry that the excessive covering of the events may give reasons to believe that society is going worse than it actually is going.
You're absolutely right. I think that is a hard balance, isn't it? You see events like this today. The converse is also true as well, isn't it? Which is that so many people turn out and say, where's the coverage? This is a big national moment. And at the same time, I think there's a reason why, for example, you won't see on France 24 that a continuation of the same images of that moment of violence, because there is that very delicate balance of telling a story and trying to portray what is going on, as is today, which takes us to that wider concept, because it is being used. It is being used by the politicians on both sides now to become this kind of touchstone moment. You've looked at the wider concept. You talked about going back to politics of the past. With that in mind, tell us about this quote that your research have recently looked at. You call it the Stairway to Terrorism. And you say it starts with the first step, selective exposure to complex political issues, which leads to step-by-step to hatred. Talk me through what you've been looking at.
Yeah. So my use of the expression of the staircase of radicalization or terrorism in the article was meant to express the point that to a large extent, political extremism is just like ordinary partisan thinking carried to the extreme. We all have a tendency to selectively expose ourselves to only sources that we agree with. We all have a tendency to not pay too much attention to people who disagree with us politically. We tend to caricature opposing viewpoints and to have low curiosity and low intellectual humility when it comes to exploring new, political vantage points, etc. And in many respects, political extremism is just those traits that most people have, you and I as well, carried to the extreme, with maybe the added element of extreme levels of dehumanization of those who are perceived as being the political opponents, and a group dynamics that reels in some young, males in general to consent to political violence and beat up basically the other side. But I was trying to express the point that we shouldn't be looking at that process of political extremism with too much naivete or condescension. There is partisan thinking in us already, and it's only a radical form, a radicalized form of it. And we should be maybe a bit more attuned to understanding the mechanisms of partisan thinking, of radicalization, and maybe be a bit more motivated to fight it in general education.
Which takes us into trying to find out a bit more about some of these groups that keep getting mentioned, the groups that are involved. And before we get to that, it goes back to what happened a few days ago, where we heard President Macron talking about what he called BS, the idea that there was free speech, and that was why the big tech giants were putting out there that the social media was about free speech. He said, what about free algorithms, which gets back to your point, I would imagine, which is about kind of the hyper-normalized world that we are in, the social media algorithms that keep similar feeds coming back. The more you want, the more that comes back to you. And I guess that is part of that stairway, that ultimately there's no correction to that.
Well, I wouldn't say that there's no correction, but if your question
is... It's not easy to be corrected when you're in a kind of a rabbit hole.
If your question is on the relationship between our basic psychology and our proclivities for extremism and social media, I would say the following. I would say that political tribalism and our tendency to become radicalized is really not new. It's part of human nature.
You don't think there's a correlation between the algorithms and a speeding up of that?
I would agree that things may become amplified and may get worse in digital environments in which hostile messages are over-promoted and in which we only have access of those most extreme tokens of what people think in society, and that's what the social media tend to do. It's called the social media prism effect. We underestimate the fact that most people in society are relatively moderate, more centrist, hostile to violence, etc. We only see those people who are most motivated to write, and those will be over-promoted by engagement maximizing algorithms. So that's the reality. I don't try to downplay that. But I would also want to highlight that our psychological disposition for polarization, effective polarization, the delegitimization and dehumanization of the other side is not new, and that's part of human nature.
Which takes us to some of these groups that not everybody might have heard of. But so the group that's the Collective Nemesis is considered a far-right feminist group. The leader of that group has said that Quentin was there providing ad hoc security with them when he was attacked by members who number have been arrested of the so-called Jeune Garde, the young guard that are classified as far left or militant ultra-left, a group that has been dissolved. Can you tell us a bit more about some of these groups? And again, it takes us back into whether their presence is inflated on social media.
Okay. So I wish I could say more about those groups. It so happens that I cannot because I'm not a specialist of the political map of Lyon and those particular extreme groups. My understanding of the dynamics of extremism are based on French cases, US cases, but they're a bit more transversal, and they are mostly based on an understanding of ordinary partisan psychology. So I won't be able to comment too much on the relationship between the Jeune Garde and the Nemesis, unfortunately.
Does it make a difference from what you've looked at in the past? When we've seen groups here in France dissolved by the government, President Macron is meeting again to look at some of these extremist militant groups. We've seen what happened across the channel in the UK. There's a group, Palestine Action. Thousands of people arrested for protesting. It's gone to the courts, and the courts have declared actually that's invalid, what the government have done. I just wonder that area, how much it works to dissolve parties, militant groups, whether that's an area you've examined.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I don't know of any experimental or empirical study of the effects of banning a radical group. On the one hand, there's a good intention. The defense would be that by doing so, the state sends a strong signal of we don't want those ideas and we don't want those kinds of people to be walking around expressing themselves freely on the street and on social media. So there's a sort of deterrence intention behind it, but there are also negative side effects potentially. It becomes harder for the renseignements généraux, for the national intelligence, to infiltrate and monitor those people if they don't have a legal or physically observable existence anymore. So it can potentially backfire. And it's entirely an empirical question which mechanism is going to prevail. Is it going to be mostly good or mostly bad for the reducing of total total political violence?
Which is very interesting, actually. I wonder then, going back to what you said at the top, which is this idea of kind of this stairway to radicalism. When we go back to what happened in Lyon, and we're hearing about the parents of Quentin Deranque saying they won't take part in that, whether you think that actually that will have a ripple effect, whether people who are perhaps closer to the centre, listening to go, you know what, actually they want to keep this as a human tragedy, not a political martyr.
So you're saying that the fact that the family is not going, for instance,
the parents,
could have the benefit of making the kind of the mobilization, the tribute to Quentin a little less politicized, a little less political.
Calmer, yes. I wonder if that's also played into what's happening today.
I mean, I don't know if it will have those effects that you describe, but I think any way of orienting future events that make what happens, what just happened in Lyon with Quentin, a little less incendiary, a little less polarized, a little less divisive is good to take. We need it in those times of turmoil. I think it can only help if some moderate, calm voices come for calm and try to lower the temperature a little bit.
The other point worth raising, you touched upon this a little bit earlier, which is groups outside, and not just groups outside of France, but also politicians outside of France. We heard from the US State Department yesterday describing the incident as terrorism, blaming left-wing extremism. We heard from Giorgia Meloni in Italy earlier this week talking again about an extremism on the left and this political culture, the rhetoric leading to violence. President Macron effectively saying, stick to your own politics, don't get involved in ours. When you look at the moment we're ahead of this election period, huge questions now on the France Insoumise, France Unbiased, where these are areas which was constant accusations towards National Rally. What are you making of that?
Yeah. So, I mean, the selective blaming of those you don't like and the tendency to systematically forget that your side may have also committed some faults, etc., is a classic of political psychology. We all tend to be hypocrites when it comes to politics, especially politicians. They will, systematically blame the other side and forget that their own rhetoric or their own decisions may have contributed to the situation of conflict. I think it's important here as a social scientist to remind orders of magnitude and to highlight the fact that statistically, as far as the data tell us, it's mostly the far right that commits political violence and that kills in France. There's a book that has been written by Isabelle Sommier and their colleagues throughout the period, covering the period of 1986, 2021. And the figures are really clear. 90% of ideologically motivated murders in the French streets are committed by the far right. Only 10% is committed by the far left, as far as we know. So, Marion Maréchal Le Pen saying that 90% of murders are committed by the far left is just total fake news, and that's a disgrace.
Well, 2 points. One on fake news, which I'll get to in a moment. The other point is actually looking at kind of the looking glass right now ahead of the elections and how this plays for, as you say, for national rallies, seeing a reputation like this in the past, but suddenly able to point the finger. And whether you think that we might see an electoral bounce for the far right as a result of what we're seeing right now, what is being magnified.
I hope not. I don't have the ability to predict the future, I think. I'm seeing the far right trying hard to make for themselves a new reputation of opposing violence, etc. I don't think...
a continuation of a detoxification.
Yeah, so this they've been pretty successful at, I think. But the figures are so clear that most of the violent riots and mobs that we're having on the French territory right now are organized by the far right. I think people know that. People are not stupid. And if journalists do their job, they should disseminate that key information. And so the kind of like de-demonization campaign that is being pushed forward by the far right should probably fail, at least on the point of political violence.
Going back to what you were saying about the psychology, what history tells us about people's innate decisions, that they could be swayed whether or not there is an algorithm. I also want to point out, we talked about the kind of the speeding up effect of social media, which is this: is a group of people protesting with placards in Paris this week saying the far left kills. And I don't know if you saw it, but it was juxtaposed with images that wasn't Quentin. It was an AI kind of generated image of somebody that, well, it gets into the realms of fake news, and it wasn't true. And it goes back to the fact that that's not being questioned, and we're seeing it manifested on the streets.
So what is it exactly that
it was an image of the wrong person.
Of the wrong person being beaten up by the
wrong person being
left.
killed attributes to the tributes to the wrong face.
Okay. Well, I mean, it's not exactly surprising. LLMs and Gen AI have invaded our lives, and political parties are obviously jumping on the occasion to produce, mass persuasion effects at a low cost. We should be very watchful of those developments because, of course, they can be highly deceitful. What's interesting about Gen AI, AI-generated pictures is that they kind of like borrow the code of verbal communication. In verbal communication, it's normal to speak in abstract terms about things, but in visual communication, there was that norm that you should only use the pictures that literally represent what is being represented. And with Gen AI, you give yourself the liberty to basically create a stereotype of the situation you're trying to portray, and that gives you much more leeway in terms of rhetoric and potentially also deception.
It's really interesting. Really good to talk to you, Antoine. Thank you for your time.
Thanks so much.
Antoine Marie, researcher in political psychology at the Centre of Political Research of Sciences Po in Paris. To say, a major French research institute.